Hello, everybody. We'll let all the attendees come into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, and I am very pleased to be hosting the launch for Mercy, a memoir of medical trauma and true crime obsession by Marcia Trahan. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions at any time during the event, and they'll be answered towards the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. I've shared the link in the chat, and you can also find it on the event page. Marcia will be in conversation with Rachel Monroe, and I will introduce them now. Rachel Monroe is the author of Savage Appetites, a meta true crime book selected as a New York Times editor's choice and listed as one of the best books of the year by Esquire, the Chicago Tribune, and Jezebel. She's a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and her work has appeared in the Best American Travel Writing 2018, New Yorker, Esquire, New York Magazine, Texas Monthly, The Guardian, and others. Marcia Trahan is a native Vermonter, a freelance book editor, and a semi-professional patient. She has earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Vermont and a Master of Fine Arts in Writing and Literature from Bennington College. Marcia's essays and poetry have appeared in Fourth Genre, Claire, Blood Orange Review, Connotation Press, Kansas City Voices, and the anthology Women Reinvented, True Stories of Empowerment and Change. Bloodletting, a post-cancer narrative, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She lives in South Burlington, Vermont with her partner, Andy, and their crazed feline companion, Phil. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. I first want to thank Powerhouse Arena for hosting this launch. And thank you to my editors at Barrel House, Mike Ingram and Lily Danziger, for so many great things that they're really too numerous to list here. And I thank Rachel Monroe for participating, and I'm so honored to have her here tonight. And finally, I want to welcome everyone who's attending, and I really hope that you enjoy the event. I'm going to start by reading from two sections from the first chapter of Mercy. And this chapter is called Murder Nights. And be advised that this material refers to violence, including sexual violence. So please take care of yourself if you need to. And this is Mercy. Late at night, when I'm bored or broken or raging inside, I bring out the snacks and turn on true crime TV. Like the players in the clear-cut moral universe of investigation discovery programs and forensic files, my favorite sources of gore, the food is either wholly bad, sugary, salty, fattening, or wholly good, organic, rich in nutrients. I tend to skip meals on busy days. By 10 p.m., I'm ravenous. Standing in the kitchen, I pack away calories during commercial breaks. Back on the sofa, before things get messy on screen, I perch on the edge of the cushion, gulping soy milk and crunching handfuls of Lay's potato chips. Squeamishness and guilt prevent me from eating while crime scenes are on display. Once thawed, frozen strawberries look like guts, squishy and limp in their ruby red puddle of juice. And shoveling forkfuls of apple pie straight from the tin feels like mocking the dead. I'm scarfing junk food and you can't have any. Next to my stack of unread books, a table lamp provides the only light in the room, except for the quick edit flashes from the TV. The moment the corpse appears, I go from consuming to being consumed. I am electrified by the sight of stab wounds and ligature marks. My heart beats faster, harder. I let in the violence that seeks my violence, devours the sorrowing anger I can only feel in the dark. Sometimes I take a throw pillow and lie back on the carpet in front of the screen, my field of vision filled with the larger than life world of the dead. So I'm going to pause there. The next sections in this chapter describe how my partner Andy and I watch a lot of TV, and they also talk about specific true crime programs and how I'm always looking for women murdered by men, how I identify with female victims. And they include some ideas about why women in particular are drawn to true crime. I'm skipping these parts in order to get to the medical aspect of the story, which is what follows. When I was 35, my thyroid was removed in 2 surgeries, 3 weeks apart. First, one half of the gland in which they found cancer, and then the other half in which they correctly assumed there was also cancer. To my eyes, the twice opened incision at the base of my throat didn't look as if my grandfatherly surgeon had performed an act of mercy. It looked like he tried to kill me. Yet I had given my consent for the procedures. The surgeon had saved my life. I couldn't understand why I didn't feel grateful toward him. How could I be angry at him? Why did I feel unsafe in my body after the cancer was gone? When I developed blood clots in my leg and lungs, I gave my consent for additional procedures at the hands of male practitioners. Again, I felt invaded, threatened even more by the treatment than by the disease itself. Sometime after this second round of interventions, I found myself drawn to true crime television, to the most horrifying stories of women brutalized, women's lives extinguished. Stories of sexual assault followed by murder answered a particular urgency, a fury in me that cried out to be vanquished. Before my medical procedures, I had avoided explicitly violent TV and film content. I had long been a Law and Order fan, but that program's more graphic episodes prompted me to turn the channel. The show's promo spots touted episodes that were, quote, ripped from the headlines, unquote, making me uncomfortably aware that there were real-life counterparts to the fictional crimes. The unrealistic pools of blood were at that time plenty real to me. I was especially unnerved by stories of murders involving sexual assault. It seemed to me that such episodes catered to men with sick fantasies, yet these stories were often written by women. I wondered why beautiful young actresses were willing to play the violated dead on autopsy tables, clad only in sheets, or to portray tough-talking detectives, trading quips with their male counterparts over the shapely, motionless bodies. Ignorant of the challenges and the horrors women faced in Hollywood, I couldn't understand why so many participated in the desecration of their gender. It was as if they had never lain awake, alone, thinking that the faint, mysterious noise they could barely make out was the sound of their front door's lock being picked. Never mistakenly perceived a man's figure in a darkened corridor as they frantically felt for a light switch. Never imagined that they would suffer through unspeakable acts in their last moments alive. But then I had always feared being raped by an intruder to a degree other women found excessive. When I was a teenager, my mother unwittingly terrified me with details of rape and murder from the true crime books she read avidly. She did not intend these to be cautionary tales. She shared them with me because she needed an audience. Mom was a lonely housewife, her life further constricted by addiction and by the chronic illnesses that plagued her for decades. I begged her not to fill my head with images of shootings, knife attacks, and sexual assaults, but she would not be denied. She had to tell someone. She was hooked on the violence that enlivened her days, as surely as she was dependent on alcohol. In the 80s, there were no 24/7 crime networks on TV, few programs with melodramatic narrators to draw you into a world of death, to make you feel you weren't completely alone in your lurid tastes. My mother had to get her fix through the silence of text. Anne Rule, with her precisely detailed psychological studies of criminals and her blood-soaked descriptions of their crimes, was Mom's favorite author. Once I was deep into my own true crime obsession, I began to understand why she so urgently needed to relate these tales. I wanted to tell someone about the strangely captivating images of ruin I absorbed in the late night hours, the same hours my mother had devoted to drinking and watching old sitcoms. But I was much too ashamed to tell anyone of my viewing habits, even Andy. Had my mother been alive, I would have discussed with her the scientific breakthroughs of forensic files, the love triangles of ID's deadly sins. I would have felt guilty about sharing my enjoyment of other women's tragedies, but I don't think I would have been able to resist making that connection with her. I had grown up believing my mother and I had nothing in common, and only learned differently after she was gone. But if my mother planted the seeds of my obsession, why did that obsession take 2 decades to emerge? Since I was a young child, Mom suffered from gastrointestinal conditions that required invasive, painful procedures. Today, I imagine asking her if she thought her many tests and surgeries led to her fascination with criminal bloodshed. She was not an introspective person. I think she would have rolled her eyes at the very idea. My mother's relentlessly self-examining daughter couldn't see how crime linked to medicine either, not for years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do my little a little picture of a clapping. Can I do that?
Sure.
I can't figure out how to make it work. Well, anyway, I virtually clap for you.
That's good.
Thank you so much for reading that. I'm glad you read those sections, because I think
good.
They really, to me, I think they show one of my favorite aspects of your book, which is how embodied it is. It's a very embodied, reading it is a very embodied experience. Both the feeling of what it feels to be like this trance of late at night watching the shows, the kind of different levels of appetite that are going on, but then also the feeling of being in a body that feels vulnerable and that has all these different associations with its own vulnerability. And I think that comes across really clearly, both of those aspects of it in that part that you read. So thanks for that.
Good, thanks.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how this book came to be. What was your process for realizing that these subjects fit together, all of these subjects, because your book it has these elements of memoir, both in some ways kind of traditional memoir, but then also this angle of memoir through a medical lens, and then also this something that's much more close to like cultural analysis of true crime. And so those elements work really nicely in juxtaposition, but I imagine that wasn't just like a lightning bolt that you knew from the very beginning. Can you just talk about how it came to be and how you realized that it was a book and not some other kind of written object?
Sure. Yeah, there was a point when I realized that. It started out as just a straightforward illness narrative. For a long time, there was nothing about true crime at all. I started writing about my medical experiences immediately after they happened. I wrote in my journal and I wrote some essays. And over time, I amassed quite a lot of material, and I really didn't know if I had the beginnings of a book. So I brought a chapter of this possible book to a writers' conference at Vermont College of Fine Arts. And after my workshop there, my instructor, Sue William Silverman, turned to me and said, "Marcia, you must write this book." And I was thrilled and terrified all at the same time. And I later asked her why she was so certain. And she said it was because of the urgency that came through the writing. Like, apparently I urgently needed to discuss my medical experiences. So I committed to writing the book basically that day. And again, it was just an illness narrative at that point, and it took a few years for true crime to kind of come creeping in as it does. I mean, I had already connected true crime to my medical experiences, but I wasn't writing about true crime in the book yet. I didn't really know how to. When I started doing it, I didn't know how to make it work in a narrative sense, and I would, put chapters in that had to do with true crime, take them out, put them in, and finally, I just got a lot of help working it into a braided narrative from my editors at Barrel House, Mike and Lily. They really helped me to see how true crime could be brought out even more than I had already written about. And they helped me to, to make it all fit in the narrative. So, so I owe a debt of gratitude to them for that, definitely. So,
yeah, a good editor is an amazing thing.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
I was struck actually just hearing you read it this time by those words that you use. I think in the very first sentence, the bored, broken, and raging, those being kind of some of the modes that I guess call you to true crime. And I was wondering if you could just talk about what it is that, I mean, that's like an interesting trifecta, right? Like they don't necessarily line up neatly, but it rings completely true to me. So I guess what it is about those emotional states, what it is that they share, and what does true crime kind of satisfy in those different modes?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're all different levels of being upset. There's anger, there's sadness, there's loneliness, there's just simply being stressed out. I think that what they all have in common where true crime is concerned is that true crime is so dramatic, it's so melodramatic, and it's often so bizarre that sometimes it's the only thing that's just weird enough to distract me from whatever my problems are. So if I'm feeling a little depressed one night and I turn on true crime, I'm going to forget about whatever is bothering me. Once I got super stressed out because I briefly lost my health insurance through a clerical error, and I was on the phone every day with the insurance company trying to get it back. I am someone who cannot go without health insurance for very long. So I was really stressed out about that, and my way of dealing with it was to look up documentaries about Ted Bundy on YouTube and courtroom footage of Ted Bundy on YouTube. And it was all just so, awful and lurid and strange, especially with the TED groupies making comments on YouTube. That was weird. it was all just strange enough that it distracted me from this really stressful thing that was happening. So yeah, basically I use true crime as a way to like tamp down my anxiety or my bad feelings, you know, whatever might be bothering me. It's something to get lost in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because I definitely relate to that, but at the same time, true crime, I think it can tamp down or distract from those anxieties, even as it kind of stokes them in the same way.
Yeah.
It's this interesting give and take that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, the question of, you know, whether true crime just adds to anxiety, for me, it doesn't add to anxiety. I mean, I guess I'm more careful about making sure my doors and windows are locked since I've been watching this stuff. But whereas I used to be really freaked out, really scared about any stories of, you know, sexual assault or any violence at all, when I began watching true crime, that fear just went away. It's like it vanished. It's like I could watch this stuff right up until the time it was time to go to bed, and turn off the light, walk up a dark staircase, go to bed, go to sleep. So for me, anyway, they did not add to my anxiety, except for making me, you know, a little bit more careful about locking things up. So it's interesting. I'm sure it's different for everyone, though.
Yeah. Well, and another thing that you do in the book that you've kind of alluded to that is interesting is that you use the true crime frame to kind of as almost like a lens to look back at your childhood and your childhood experiences and sort of seen through the lens of true crime. I don't know, what did that reveal for you using that as sort of a mode of inquiry?
Yeah, well, true crime helped me to make connections between past and present that I had never made before. Like it made me start to think about how I was a really anxious child. And of course, I already knew that, but I started to think about the things specifically that I was anxious about as a child. And very often it was stuff that I saw on TV. It was anything scary on TV. I was just terrified of. Like I was terrified of horror movie trailers, even really tame things. I was terrified of Bigfoot. And all of that led, I think, to my becoming a fearful adult. And I had never made that connection before. And I also started looking at childhood experiences concerning men that were scary and thinking of that in conjunction with my mother's true crime stories about scary men. And all of that taught me to be afraid of men, which wasn't even something that I was consciously aware of until I started, you know, started thinking about it. But if you have a subconscious fear of men, then true crime will bring it out with all of the parade of scary men that it brings through. So it helped me to make all those connections, and I actually started to understand my past and present in a different way. And I realized also that if I hadn't had, you know, scary experiences and traumatic experiences in childhood, I might not have experienced the medical procedures as traumatic. I'll never know. But we all bring our own histories to, you know, the exam room and the operating room. So I think everyone reacts differently. We all have, you know, unique histories. So, and I certainly have mine. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which when you watch true crime, you get primed to look for these kind of scary moments that are indicating that something terrible is going to happen later. And I just couldn't help thinking, there's this one scene in your book where you're talking about, I think you were like 11 years old or something, and your dad has this friend Randy, who's like a man in his 40s, 50s, I don't know, who like becomes obsessed with your teenage sister and is like sniffing her shoe. And that is like a scene out of a true crime TV show, and like, thank God that it wasn't. But that's, you know, that's one of those things where it's a signpost of like, this is an unhinged man.
Yeah, that was exactly one of those experiences in childhood where I learned to be afraid of men. Like I didn't really know
But
what
it's interesting because
was
it's not reacted to in the moment. It seems like the adults around you didn't necessarily indicate to you.
right. I mean, yeah, my parents didn't react appropriately. Yeah, this guy was in his 40s, and he wanted to date my teenage sister, and you know, I was just a little kid, so I didn't know what date actually referred to. Um, but yeah, he asked my father if he could date my sister, and of course my father said no, but he didn't throw him out of the house, and my mother didn't ban this person from our house either, and he really should have been, especially with the cradling her footwear incident and this other incident where, you know, he and another drinking buddy parked in front of our house and shone the headlights into the living room window as if he was, you know, he was probably watching for her. So all of that was very scary. And yeah, the adults, you know, my parents didn't react, you know, appropriately at the time. And my sisters didn't really talk about it. And I didn't know how to process it because I was just a kid. I didn't know what it all meant. But that's another way another thing that I thought of when I started watching true crime. It was like, wow, this episode about a stalking, this really reminds me of that creepy guy, Randy, who was after my sister. So yeah.
And to turn to the medical trauma aspect of your book, which plays such a key role, I wonder if, was that language that you arrived at in the moment? Did you call these experiences traumatizing as they were happening, or was that something that you came to kind of afterwards? Because I do appreciate how it seems like there are different kinds of fear and response that happen, you know, with the diagnosis, with the procedure, and then after the procedure. You know, that's not a safe zone.
Yeah. But yeah, the language that I used, I definitely did not call the procedures traumatic at the time that they happened. I think I just thought of them as scary without thinking of the implications of scary, you know, scary, traumatic. It's pretty much the same thing. But if I had thought of the word trauma, I think that I would have seen it as melodramatic, like I was just overreacting. So it was, you know, after I started, you know, watching true crime and thinking critically about these things, that's when I realized that the medical procedures were trauma. And as for the term medical trauma, it is a term, and I'm actually not sure if I thought of it first or if my editors thought of it first. I did do research on it while I was working on revisions for the book. And it's something that you can Google. It's like everywhere. It's something that trauma counselors talk about. And you can also find discussions of it on Twitter, like there's a hashtag medical trauma. So it is a term that's out there in the world. And when my editors suggested it as part of the subtitle, I definitely agreed to that. So yeah.
And can you talk about some of the correspondences that you ended up kind of finding or identifying between the way that bodies exist in this medical space and how they're depicted in some of the true crime you were watching at the time?
Yeah, there are parallels, definitely. I mean, that's why I binge watched so much true crime because there were parallels, although I wasn't able to describe them right away. In true crime, women's bodies are treated like objects. And when you're a patient, you do often feel like an object. You have no agency of your own. So in true crime, basically a woman is only interesting and worthy of our attention if she's dead, if she's a victim. And a dead woman is like the perfect example of femininity. She's still and silenced. And thinking about that made me think of how when I was being prepped for medical procedures, male doctors were only too happy to give me conscious sedation drugs, which are incredibly powerful drugs, and they make you still and quiet and compliant. And once I was on those drugs, they could move ahead with their procedures. They didn't have to deal with my fear. They didn't have to answer my questions. They really didn't have to talk to me at all. And I'm not saying that they, got off on it in any sexual sense, or that they even meant anything harmful by it. But um, I could tell that their job was a whole lot easier once I was quiet. Um, so yeah, and being on those drugs and undergoing a procedure while on those drugs, it felt like being on the edge of death, because I wasn't a person acting out in the world. I was just an object that was being acted upon, and that's a realization that I came to later.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. I see there are already some in the Q&A over there, but if you guys have, you can both listen to us talk and think about formulate your question. You talk in the excerpt that you just read, you mentioned the watching the true crime, how it kind of stoked or allowed you to access some of your fury, I think is the word that you use. I'm wondering if that was the primary benefit, or what were the kind of unexpectedly therapeutic aspects of these true crime binges that you came to understand, and if there were also like limitations to using this as a way to deal with what had happened to you.
Yeah. Well, true crime is at best a crude tool to deal with trauma. I mean, true crime was for a long time the only thing that was acknowledging the fact that scary things happen to bodies, because there was no one and nothing else that was telling me that. So I appreciated it on that level. And also, as I've mentioned, it was the thing that prompted me to think of my medical procedures as traumatic. But of course, it's TV, and it's not meant to, to heal trauma. There are much healthier ways to deal with trauma. Like I've tried journaling, visualizations, yoga, meditation, and all of those things have been extremely helpful. And at the time that Mercy was accepted for publication, I was actually in the process of looking for a trauma therapist. And I became so involved in the process of revisions and the other work that you have to do to prepare a book for publication that I felt like I couldn't commit to this really intensive form of therapy. But I've been in lots of other kinds of therapy for other reasons, and I believe in therapy. So at some point I will, have to find a specialist someone who specializes in trauma, and try to work through, what I still need to work through, because I have watched many, many hours of true crime by now, and I'm still afraid of medical interventions. So I can't say that it's solved anything for me. It's pointed some things out to me, though. So, yeah.
And maybe with that in mind, you call the surgeon's cut like an act of mercy or something. Were there other? I'm sure the word mercy has more resonances for you as the title of the book. Like what are some of the mercies that came to you, or what did that word come to mean?
Yeah, well, mercy refers to different things in the book. It does refer to life-saving medical treatment. Mercy is the name of a lot of hospitals for a good reason. Mercy was something that I failed to give myself. I attempted suicide once, and so at that time I had no mercy for myself. So that's part of the story as well, that I am the only person who has actually tried to physically harm me. And there's just, I guess, the idea of forgiving yourself, giving yourself a break, showing yourself mercy in that way. So yeah, it operates on several different levels, and of course criminals who fail to show mercy by attacking people. So
Right.
yeah, it has
And
all those meanings.
you talk about the medical, various like medical killers, and sometimes angels of mercy, right? That's like one specific subtype of medical serial killer. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, when you're in a medical position, you're at the mercy of someone, which has both that kind of beneficial and also terrifying connotation. So
Right, like that person could show you mercy by helping you, or
yeah,
they could withhold mercy by killing you.
right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We can go to these Q&As.
Okay.
Do you want me to? I can read. I think that's nice. I'll ask them to you.
Okay, that sounds nice. Yes, go ahead.
Tom asks. Oh, Tom notes that you mentioned the Ted Bundy groupies who were commenting in the YouTube videos. Maybe we could like explain what you're talking about and just thoughts on this weird phenomenon that attaches itself to some people who become famous for committing heinous crimes.
Oh my God, I would love to talk about the TED groupies. That's so much fun. It's so crazy. And I know that you're interested in them too, Rachel. So
I know about
yeah,
the TED ones. That's all you.
yeah. The TED groupies, I encountered them on YouTube. Like I would, watch a documentary or some news footage of Ted Bundy, and I looked at the comments and I was like, oh my God, because all of these women, and they seem to be young women, although who knows who they really are, but they seem to be young women, and they were saying things like, oh Ted, I love you so much, I miss you so much. I feel like I have so much in common with you. And, people describing his voice as sexy when he was actually describing killing someone. People just going on and on and on about, how beautiful they thought he was. And it's like, didn't you watch this documentary? Didn't you see him get convicted in court? It's like there's no question he really did these crimes, and he even ended up confessing to a lot of them. So there's no question of his guilt. There's no like, oh, I believe he's innocent and I want to save him or something. But Anne Rule talks about the TED groupies in her book about Ted Bundy, who she actually knew. Her book is The Stranger Beside Me, and she's gotten, or she is now deceased, but she had gotten letters from women all over the world. It wasn't just women in the United States who were TED groupies. There were, for some reason, a lot of women in Italy, just women from all over, who, and women who said that when he was executed, they were depressed because he was dead. So what's behind all of this exactly? I've given a lot of thought to it. And I think that it's the ultimate expression of a rape culture, because in my mind, the hero of a rape culture is a man who is a serial rapist and murderer. Ted Bundy looks like the conquering hero. He conquered all of these women. So I think that in a culture that valorizes rape, that Ted Bundy is actually a hero. And I don't know that this is happening, on a conscious level, but I think it's just part of the undercurrents of our culture. So that's my theory anyway.
Yeah, that's an incredible way to put it. I think that really sums it up succinctly. I mean, I would say that it's interesting to me that I also see these women as in some ways just enacting or embodying the fame that we have as a society given to certain killers, the celebrities, right? It was interesting that we call them groupies, right? Groupies are usually for rock stars. And I think we can't deny that when we as a culture elevate somebody to this rock star position, which I think we have done with Ted Bundy or even the Columbine killers, even as we're condemning them, we're making like so many TV shows about them. They have a kind of iconic look. We know what jackets they wore, what music they listened to, what car they drove. And so these women, in some ways, I sometimes I feel like I certainly do not condone anybody's veneration of Ted Bundy, but I think in some ways they're just showing us what our culture, they're revealing to us what we as a culture value, even if we are pretending that we don't. And so I flinch a little bit at the idea of condemning them without necessarily looking at ourselves and looking at what's on our TV shows, what's in our, what's on our, who do we feature in our podcasts? If we're going to grant somebody celebrity, then we can't then be like, pretend to be shocked and horrified when they get groupies. And I will say the accounts that I have read, not in any kind of scientific way, of young women who do become fixated on these murders, a lot of times they have trauma in their past too. And so this is not just, I think it's very simplistic to look at it as some sort of like, oh, just like these sick girls, these bad sick girls, but instead maybe there's something much more complicated going on that they're working through, trying to like say in a non-direct way.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to just make fun of girls and women who do this, but you have to think of the culture. I mean, they didn't come out of nowhere. There's a reason, and yeah, you're right. It's like, serial killers are criminals, and what does that say about our? I mean, serial killers are celebrities, and what does that say about our culture and how obsessed we are with celebrities? It's totally sick in that regard. So yeah, it's not the girls and women's fault that they have these feelings. So,
but maybe they don't need to be making the YouTube comments.
That would be nice if they stayed on YouTube. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
We have a question here. Somebody wants to know how long it took you to write. I'm curious about this too. How long it took you to write the book, including the time it took to write the essays that have gone into the book. And I'd also be curious about like, did you write it as essays that then became stitched together, or did you what does that actual process look like?
Do you mean writing the book proper, or just when I started writing about medical experience?
I think you can answer the question, whatever seems like most accurate or useful to you. You know, if we're thinking that we're talking to a group of many other writers in the audience, maybe thinking about their own projects.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, like I was saying before, on an earlier question, I started writing about the medical experiences as soon as they happened. So the thyroid surgeries were in 2006. So I started writing about that then. And by the time I had that epiphany moment about, oh, I have a book here, that was in 2013. So it took, 7 years to write. I was writing essays. I was writing like individual, stories or vignettes about the different things that had happened to me, and I wasn't combining them yet. And then, and I kept writing in this very fragmented way, and that's why it was hard to see this as a book. I thought it might be a collection of essays. But by the time I went to the conference at Vermont College of Fine Arts, I was starting to write chapters. I was starting to write, things with longer scenes and connected scenes. And so that period of writing the book as a book with chapters, that took 5 years with, and then with several months of revisions after it was accepted for publication. So,
did you ever think about giving up on it?
I really never felt like I could give up on it. I kept going back to this conference year after year because it kept giving me a shot in the arm that would just, carry me through the next 12 months. It was incredible. And I kept in touch with the writers that I met there, and sometimes we traded work. And that was, that support was just, was just crucial. So no, I don't ever remember feeling like I was going to give up on the book. I was committed.
It's so important to have those, I think for a lot of us to have those, writing can be such a solitary life, so to have those external accountability, or just somebody else who you feel like is in it with you, or somebody else is like, hey, how is this going? Looking forward to reading more, can be so meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I work as a freelance editor, and a lot of my clients just don't have anyone else to show their work to except for me. And so I try to encourage them to, go out and take a writing class, or, join a critique group, or, find someone online, find someone, other than just this one person. Because you're going to need the support, because writing is a really hard process, and writing a book is a really long and hard process. So you're gonna need people to get you through that. So yeah.
We have a question here from somebody who sounds like works with you with editing, who wants to know, who says, one of my favorite aspects you discuss in the book is your battle with depression. How were you able to hide this from those of us who've been your editing clients over the years? How were you able to provide such stellar editing during these times of depression? And I also, maybe I would add to that, like, I wonder if, do you find writing about depression challenging?
Yeah, let me answer that, or answer Rachel's question first. It's a little easier. Your question was, is it hard to write about depression?
Yeah, or just what is that like for you?
Yeah, it is hard to write about depression, because it's not a very interesting state of mind. I mean, you feel terrible. I did write an earlier essay about a really serious bout of suicidal depression that I had, and it's not part of the book. It doesn't really belong in the book, but so I wrote about depression only as much as I needed to for this book, because it wasn't really central. It is really hard to write about it in a way that's going to make any kind of sense to someone who hasn't experienced depression themselves. It's such an agitated and, or for me anyway, an agitated and despairing state of mind. I actually had more about depression in the book, and that ended up being cut away, during revisions, because it didn't actually have to do directly with trauma. So, but yeah. So the other part of the question, how did I hide my depression from my editing clients? Writing emails, you can sound cheerful and competent, and that's there goes my secret. You don't have to reveal your mental state when you're writing an email. So, and it's also just, I've suffered from depression since I was a teenager. So I know very well how, unfortunately, I know very well how to hide it, even from people I live with. I know how to, kind of put it aside, and try to act normal, try to act like everything is okay, even if I have to go off somewhere later and cry. So, but don't worry, I haven't had depression in a long time. So, so doing great these days.
There's so many good questions. This one's really interesting. Do you have suggestions for writers who may want to write about their own personal traumatic experiences? How to know what's going to be interesting to readers versus what might just be interesting to you, the writer? What belongs as kind of therapeutic journaling, and what belongs, what is a memoir that an audience, for an audience?
Well, there's a book that you might want to check out. It's called The Wounded Storyteller, and it talks about different kinds of illness narratives. And one of the kinds of illness narratives that it talks about is the chaos narrative. And that's something where you're probably not going to find published examples of it, because it is like journal writing. It's like your best friend coming up to you and saying, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and it was awful. And there's no context, there's no shaping of the story. So if you're at that place where trauma is fresh and you don't have perspective on it, and you don't, and you haven't worked on it very much, if you try to write about it, it's probably going to come through as chaos narrative. In other words, it's not going to be a story that other people are going to be able to take in and empathize and relate to. People kind of tune out from chaos narratives after a while because they're just exhausting. So when do you know that you can write about trauma for an audience? I would say when, probably a few years later, as I've described, it took me, years from having these medical experiences to actually being able to shape a book from them. So in my experience, it takes years, but you can test it out by, trying to write about traumatic experiences and then just showing it to someone, preferably not a family member or a close friend who has, who might be biased. But maybe, join a critique group or take a writing class and just see what people's reaction is. And you'll know very quickly if they're interested or not. And you will probably get some great feedback about how to shape the story. But yeah, I would say you usually can't write about trauma immediately because it's just it takes so much time to process, and it might hurt too much to write about it immediately also. So there's that to consider. So yeah.
A possibly related question, was there any difference in how you approached revising the memoir portions versus the portions that had more cultural analysis, the parts that were maybe more distant from your personal experience?
Basically everything that you see in the finished book has gone under intensive revisions. I did a ton of, I'm an editor, so, it's my inclination to do a lot of revision. So I was, when I was working on the book on my own, I was constantly moving chapters around, taking sections out, putting them back in. And that was true of the memoir parts as well as the true crime parts. And then, when the book was accepted for publication, and thank God I had the help of my editors who were like just amazing. They helped me to, shape the material. But again, I worked intensively on the memoir sections and I worked intensively on the true crime sections. So I wouldn't say that I put more work into one than the other.
And maybe this seems like a good question to close on. It would seem this book represents a catharsis of sorts for you, ? So I guess you can say with this. What are you driven to write about next?
Oh, I am so excited to think of what I'll write next, and I have no idea what it is. I really don't have any idea what I want to do next because I'm still so invested in Mercy right now. So I'm sorry, what was the beginning part of the question?
It was about whether this book represents a catharsis.
Oh, catharsis, yes. Yeah, people often ask if it's therapeutic, if it's cathartic, and it is in a sense. It is very hard to, well, it's hard to write about any painful experience, but it's hard to write about trauma. It was hard for me to go back and look at medical records. It was hard for me to go back and look at journals. Nobody really wants to do that, but I needed to do that to make a truthful account. But writing this book did do an amazing thing for me. it helped me to make sense of my life in a way that I had never made sense of it before. It's like all of these disparate pieces of my life, past and present, it's like now they all fit. And now they all fit into this story. And it's not just a story that I can tell other people, it's also a story that I can tell myself. And that is very comforting and very gratifying. And I'm so glad that I put the work into this, because otherwise I wouldn't fully understand myself. And we don't get a lot of chances to fully understand ourselves in this life. So I got mine in it, and I feel very lucky. So yes.
Well, thank you so much for sharing it with us, and congratulations.
Oh, thanks so much. And thanks so much for doing this, Rachel. So this has been fun, as we thought.
Hi again.
Hi
Hi.
again.
Thank you to Marcia and Rachel, and to everybody who asked questions. If anybody missed any of the event, we'll have it on YouTube soon. And please buy the book. There's a link on the chat page and also on the event page. Every book helps us put on more free events, and it's 10% off for a limited time. So thank you, and thank you again, Marcia. Congratulations, and thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.